Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. We're now going into chapter 16, which is a very pivotal chapter in the whole of the Gospel because it's in chapter 16 that Jesus founds the church. And I said to you in the last episode that Jesus was rejecting the Jewish magisterium, which is their teaching authority, and he was going to bestow it on Peter. So let's look at the very beginning of this chapter first. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, that means the Sanhedrin. The Sadducees were the priests in the Sanhedrin, and they were very influential and very powerful. They came, and to test him, they asked if he would show them a sign from heaven. Now, this is the second time that they have come and asked him for a sign from heaven. Jesus is coming out of the Gentile territories and he's coming back into Israel. The Gentiles don't ask him for any signs. They only ask to be included. They only want to be part of what he's doing and who he is. He comes back into Israel and immediately he's tested. And they're looking for a sign. Now, Jesus has already given them two sets of signs. One set are called the Isaiah signs and the other set are called the Mosaic signs. The Isaiah signs are opening the eyes of the blind, unstopping the ears of the deaf, releasing the tongues of the dumb, and cleansing the lepers, raising the dead, and so on. They're all the signs, and we've already dealt with that as we saw back in chapter 11, for example. And Jesus has now given them some, but not all yet, of the Mosaic signs, which is giving them manna from heaven. And he has already walked on water. So Moses gave them a water miracle and Jesus gave them a water miracle. He still has to be transfigured on the mountain like Moses was transfigured on the mountain, and he still has to bring them through the Passover event. So the Mosaic signs are still an incomplete picture for us. They don't see it at all. Now, when they demand a sign, Jesus had told them back in a couple of chapters earlier in chapter 11, the only sign I'm going to give you is the sign of Jonah. That is that the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. Okay, so you have to remember that when they're demanding a sign, they're looking for something utterly spectacular. Now, the only other person who demanded an utterly spectacular sign was Satan, and that was back in the wilderness. But John the Baptist had said that Israel was spiritually reduced to a wilderness at the time of Christ. And so out of the wilderness, these men, the most unlikely people to mouth the same temptation as Satan. The most unlikely people. It's really kind of frightening, you know. And so Jesus told them, you're able to say from looking at the signs of the sky whether it's going to rain or whether the weather is going to be fine. Why can't you read the signs of the times? The signs of the times were all messianic signs and Jesus has given them to them. But they don't want that. They want something utterly spectacular. I think the only spectacular thing that would have touched them was that he would suddenly turn all his followers into an army and take on Rome. Because after the death of Jesus, a number of false messiahs showed up in Israel, and they eventually took the people to war against Rome to their own destruction. And so he said, the only sign that's going to be given to you is the sign of Jonah. Now, this is the second time we've heard this. And this is important before we move into the founding of the church. It's actually quite important, and we have to remember it, but of course I'll remind you. And Jesus just walked away and left them there. He wasn't going to pander to their desires. So immediately after this is verses 5 to 12, the disciples having crossed to the other shore, in other words, they're coming in from the east side back into Israel, they'd forgotten to take any food with them. I love this. Now, Mark does much more with this incident than Matthew does. And Jesus said to them, keep your eyes open and be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they said to themselves, oh, it's because we don't have any bread that he's talking like that. He's bringing up the subject of yeast simply because we haven't provided any food. And Jesus said, men of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Haven't you experienced 2 miracles of me providing bread? Now, Mark really goes to town on this. And if Matthew has treated Mark as his source, he has certainly treated the material rather differently. Do you not yet understand? Jesus said, do you not remember the 5 loaves that fed 5,000 people and the number of baskets you collected? And they said, or the 7 loaves and the 4,000 people and the number of baskets you collected? How could you fail to understand that I was not talking about bread? What I was saying, that you're to beware of the influence, because yeast is influence. You put yeast into dough and it influences the whole dough. You've had that already in a parable in chapter 13. But the apostles don't seem to remember the parable. I was saying beware of the influence of the scribes and the Pharisees, because they're leading the people astray. And I've already told you that they are blind guides leading you into the ditch. Then they understood that he was telling them to be on their guard, not against the yeast for making bread, but against the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. That means that you're being told that the apostles were very slow to understand. They were very slow to penetrate the meaning of things, but I don't think we are any different. I think spiritually we're all quite slow in really getting the point. So this is the introduction that Matthew gives you to the incident at Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus actually founded the church. So you can see from this whole question about the influence of the scribes and Pharisees that the apostles are not with Jesus in any real sense. They're physically present, but they are not with him, understanding what he's doing, understanding what he's trying to achieve, understanding where he is going. And I just completely admire Jesus' perseverance and his patience with them, considering that they understand so little of what he's doing. So we now go into this wonderful text that happened at Caesarea Philippi. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, now you're way up in the north, because he's come down from Tyre and Sidon, come in through the north. He wants to found the church in a place that is as far away from Jerusalem that he can get and still be within Israel. That's what he wants. So it's absolutely in the north. This Caesarea Philippi is on the southern slopes of Mount Hermon, and it's near the ancient city of Dan. At the time of the kings, the people measured the country from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. So it's actually quite close to that ancient city of Dan. Very beautiful place. And it's one of the, it's very close to one of the sources of the Jordan River. There was a shrine there to the god Pan, and therefore it had been called Paneas. Originally, this place had been called Paneas, but Philip wanted to ingratiate himself with Caesar, and so he built a city. Now, what they call a city, we would call a town or a village. It was actually quite small by comparison with what we would call towns or cities today. And so he called the place Caesarea Philippi after Caesar and after himself. And this is the place that Jesus decided he was going to, simply because it was far away from Jerusalem and therefore was far away from opposition. He had only one problem, major problem, and that is that Judas was present. And because Judas was present, Jerusalem was going to hear about it as soon as the message could get there. It's really, really sad. Judas caused incredible pain to Jesus. So they came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, and he put this question to his disciples: who do the people, now these are the vacillating crowds, this Ganea, this generation, who do the people say the Son of Man is? Now, since the people are not really with Jesus, they're not going to get a good response. But at least they'll hear what's being said. And they said, well, some think you're John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist is dead. Some think you're Elijah. Elijah is dead. Some think you're Jeremiah. Jeremiah is dead. Some think you're one of the other prophets. They're all dead. Why do they think Jesus is just a revamped version of the past? They believe in reincarnation, but they don't believe in the presence of God actually in their presence. Do you know many Catholics are like that? They will believe in reincarnation, they'll believe in stuff that comes in from other religions. Will they believe that Jesus is really present with us in the Blessed Eucharist? And they might question it. It's quite incredible. And so they said that he was just a sort of history being coughed up to us again, rehashed, nothing new. And this was the greatest divine visitation the world had ever known, that God would walk the earth with us. It's just quite incredible. So since the people are of that opinion, they are certainly not with Jesus in any sense of the word. And they cannot be relied on for anything. So Jesus said, but you who have committed yourself to me, you who have become apostles, and you who are disciples, what do you think? In other words, the world will have all kinds of opinions about Christ, and does have, and say all kinds of things about him, but the church needs to be sure. The church needs to be sure, because otherwise the church cannot continue to give life to the world. And he said, but you, who do you say that I am? Now you have to go back to chapter 14, when Jesus appeared to them walking on the water, and he told them, Ego eimi, I am. He revealed his divinity to them. Do any of them remember it? It was Simon Peter who spoke up and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now Peter gets 10 out of 10 for that. Jesus replied, Simon, son of Jonah? What? The man's name wasn't son of Jonah. If you go to chapter 21 of John's Gospel, you will hear Jesus addressing him as Simon, son of John. So why does Matthew put son of Jonah in there? I just want to put that in, and then we'll come back to it. Simon, son of Jonah, you are a happy man, or you are to be envied, because it was not flesh and blood that revealed this to you. In other words, you wouldn't come to that conclusion by just looking at me as a young man. You wouldn't come to that conclusion. This has to be a revelation from God. And of course, it's part of God calling this fisherman into the position of being the leader of the church. And now I say to you, you are Peter. Now this is Matthew's Gospel. And from the very beginning, any mention of this man, he has been given his Peter title. And so it was Simon Peter who spoke up before the title Peter was given to him. And this is Matthew, because Matthew is writing after all these events have happened, and after the terrible judgment given to Jerusalem as well. And everybody in the church knows this man as Simon Peter. They no longer have any reference in their heads to Simon the fisherman. The man they have been and are dealing with as the shepherd of the flock is a completely transformed human being. Simon the fisherman has now become Peter of Jesus. And it's Peter they know. And Matthew is saying something more as well, which I'll come back to. You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the underworld will never hold out against it. I give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be considered bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be considered loosed in heaven. And then he gave the disciples strict orders not to tell anybody he was the Christ. Of course, the one person who's going to disobey is Judas. So Here we've got this major text that we all know off by heart, but sometimes we don't know what's behind it. Okay. Simon, son of Jonah. Twice Jesus has answered the scribes and Pharisees who wanted a major sign from heaven, and he said, the only sign that will be given to you is the sign of Jonah. So Jesus is saying, Simon of the sign, because the sign was the sign of Jonah the prophet. In other words, Peter will not come into this role that Jesus is giving to him until after this sign has been given, after the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's why it's this that's given to him. There's another side to Simon of Jonah as well, and that is, you have to remember the book of Jonah, which I've already referred to some episodes back, that Jonah was the reluctant prophet who was asked to go to the Gentile world power at the time and go to the capital city of that world power and preach the word of God. Now, if Jesus had said to Simon Peter at this moment, I require you to go to Rome and preach the gospel, Peter would have retired instantly. He would have had exactly the same reluctance as Jonah, because he had the same opinion of Rome as Jonah had of Nineveh. In other words, it was a sin city. How could you possibly save anybody there? And yet that was his destiny. And look how carefully the Lord will tell you something that pertains to the future. He tells you only the bit you can take now, and gradually you will understand the rest of it. So after the sign, Simon will be able to actually do what the Lord wants, but he's not ready now. And to tell somebody something before they're ready doesn't actually help, not at all. And so Jesus gives it to him piece by piece. Also, it would have been very dangerous information to say in the presence of Judas, who would have taken it straight back to Jerusalem, and Jesus would have been killed way ahead of time. Okay. So the Father gives Simon Peter as a gift to his Son. He said, flesh and blood hasn't revealed this, it was my Father in heaven. And you will hear when Jesus prays his priestly prayer in John 17, you'll hear him saying, yes, you gave them to me, and now that I have cleaned them up and trained them and put them on their feet and made them servants of yours, I give them back to you, all cleaned up and ready. And so the apostles are a gift of the Father to the Son, and then after redemption, the gift of the Son back to the Father. And so you've got this mutual giving in the Blessed Trinity. And the new name is terribly important because it indicates a new office, okay? Now, one of the things that we really need to look at is that Jesus is building his church, and he decides to build his church on this rock that is Simon Peter. Now, you have to go back into the book of Kings, and you find in the first book of Kings, for example, chapters 5 and 6, that Solomon, the wise man, built his house on a rock, and that rock was Jerusalem. So he built the dynasty of David on this rock, which is Jerusalem. And we were told back in chapter 7, verse 25, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, that the person who does the will of God is the one who is building his own personal life on the rock of God's will. And therefore, when the trials come, they won't be destroyed. If you go back into the book of Isaiah, chapter 22, and verse 22, you read a very important statement. And it was to do with the person who would be running the kingdom for the king. In other words, nowadays we would say the CEO. In those days they said the steward, the chief steward. And the man's name was Shebna. And whatever he did wrong, he was expelled from office. So this was what was said to his successor. I place the key of the house of David on this new person, okay? I place it on his shoulder. Now, responsibility was always put on your shoulder. Should he open nobody can close. And should he close, nobody can open. That is the language that Jesus has just used for Peter. I drive him like a peg into a firm place, and he will become a throne of glory for his Father's house. So what you're being told here is that in the kingdom of Judah, the king would always have a chief steward taking care of all the properties and everything in the kingdom. He would literally run it for him. The king would make the laws and he would be the titular head, but this other person is actually running it. And in the kingdom of God, Jesus is the king. And so Peter is actually appointed the chief steward or the CEO. Or if you want to use modern language in a democracy, he's the prime minister. If you take the kingdom of Great Britain, for example, you have the Queen, and she is not actually physically running the place. The government is running it, and the person in charge of the government is the prime minister. So that's the position that Peter is in. It's always my church. It's Jesus' church, it's not Peter's church. And this is going to be quite important when we get to chapter 17. It's my church, it's actually not yours. They're my people, they're not yours. It's my word, it's not yours. It's my kingdom, it's my power, it's my glory. You are my steward, you are my servant. I've just given you this position, but I've given you the keys to the kingdom. That means that you have the authority to rule. And so the chief steward will then give you an insight into the wedding feast at Cana of Galilee, because that whole incident is also a prophetic picture of the church, and the chief steward represents Peter and all his successors. I'll give you a little insight into that. So Jesus is the new Solomon, the new wise man, because he said himself, a greater than Solomon is here. And he gives it a name, Petros, or rock. It's Petros in Greek, it's Kepha in Aramaic. And it's on this rock that Jesus is building his church. Now, the Protestant churches don't accept that Peter is the rock, and they will give all kinds of strange explanations of that, but it's very clear from the text that it's on Peter that the church is actually being founded. Hence, we say that the successors of Peter are the Petrine ministry. We call the popes have the Petrine ministry. So when Abraham was being used by God to start the whole faith in Israel, Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son, and the whole thing was based on the sacrifice of Isaac. When Moses started the whole Mosaic era, it was based on the Passover sacrifice that took place in Egypt. And the sacrifice of Jesus on Calvary is going to be the sacrifice that is what the church is actually built on, and it's the very center of its reality, and it's the source of all its power and all its grace. So I just wanted to see how it connects with the Old Testament. Jesus is not breaking away, doing something that nobody has ever heard of before. So here, Peter has declared Jesus that he is the Messiah, and he knows that he's the Davidic king. So we'll pick it up from there in our next session. Thank you for listening. Shalom agus banach they live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Each one of us is on a journey. Some of us are on the journey of growing up. Some of us are in education. Some of us are falling in love, going to work, struggling with unemployment or ill health. We all need to have the scriptures open to us. We all need to encounter Jesus on the road. I really warmly welcome the work of Shalom World Television. Thank you for the way in which you assist in the mission of the church, helping them to come to terms with the eternal truth as it applies in their lives, whatever their journey. And I extend my blessing to you and to all your viewers, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Shalom World, God's own channel.